too little for Mr. Hellman, I realize that.
Yes, as a lawyer and an American lawyer, American Washington lawyer and so forth, we are writing briefs, but they're anything but brief. And so, but I'll try to keep it short and sweet. We're at a momentous time in American history. You all know that. You see it from the news, or you see various descriptions of what's happening. And I hearken back to one of our founding fathers. You probably all have heard of Benjamin Franklin, old Ben Franklin, who wrote Poor Richard, Almanac, and various other works. And he was our ambassador to the French court, and he enlisted the French government to ensure that we could win the revolution. He did many things, but one of the things was when he was at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, he came out of the hall and this lady said, "What kind of government, what form of government have you given us, Mr. Franklin?" To which Ben replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." And to this day, we still have, as you all do in your own countries, this task before you, to keep, if you have a good form of government, a republic, democracy, however you frame it, a government that answers the needs of the people, then you want to keep that, don't you? Well, we're at a stage today where we have as they say in the corporate world, a consummate disruptor who's been elected. Have you ever heard that term, a disruptor? There's a great premium in the corporate world on disruption. And isn't it true that this man who's been elected, Donald J. Trump, regardless of what any of you may think of him, have heard of him, what anybody in this building thinks of him, he is indeed a disruptor. And yet also, so I think what we have to look for is a positive disruption if we insist upon it. If we as citizens, we American citizens, insist upon the good elements that need to be changed, and also insist on keeping those things which ought not be changed. So that's my goal as one of those lobbyists that they speak of. I'm a pro bono lobbyist for various causes, for environment, international environment, for peace and security in the Middle East, and for fair treatment to all nations, including Israel and all the other nations of the Middle East. But we are faced with an unprecedented state of affairs in the U.S. government. We have an administration headed by a real estate mogul and showman. We have a cabinet of generals and businessmen. We have a Congress with majorities from the Republican Party in the Senate and the House, and therefore we also are going to have a new Supreme Court justice appointed, our 9th Supreme Court justice, who will be the deciding vote, and he will undoubtedly be a conservative Republican with views that mirror what President Trump and the members of Congress, the majority, were on which they were elected. And so that's going to be very interesting as well, to replace Justice Anton Scalia, who died last year. Now, we also have, I must say, and this is saying it very kindly, a contentious relationship with the conventional press and media. The print press and electronic press pretty much are at loggerheads with the new president and in what he's doing. And on the other hand, social media is breaking forth, so that not only is our president-elect a Twitter fan who tweets morning, noon, and night. I don't know if he sleeps, but he tweets. And others tweet back. And so I think we've segued to an electronic media era more than ever before. And but this is not completely new. None of these things are completely new. If you review American history, Donald Trump comes forth with tweets. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had fireside chats I'm way too young to remember that, but my father told me about it. And he would be by the fireplace in the White House and the library on the radio. And he would comfort and console the people during the Depression and then in World War II that things were going to be all right, and he was doing all he could and so forth. And going back previously, his cousin of the other party, Teddy Roosevelt, called the White House a bully pulpit. So he thought it was as if he was a preacher in church or in some other house of worship, and he could preach to the people and urge and exhort them as to what to do. So there's nothing new under the sun, as the proverb says. So I think we're going to have, as the old Chinese, pardon me, but I think it's an old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And so we surely do live in interesting times, but we're hopeful. And most important, we're looking at the people who are most, I'm looking at, we have some here today, the people who are most important. And as my friend from California says, he always reminds us, he says, we are the fourth branch of government. The people, the voters, the informed voters who come here under our Constitution. Part of the First Amendment of the Constitution is not just freedom of press, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, but also freedom to petition our government for redress of grievances. So as you can see, many people in America have many grievances. And trust me, they're all here or soon will be here on all sides of every issue coming for redress of what they see as grievances. And they're free to do so. If someone said they had seen one of these hearings where one of the nominees was testifying, and what you've probably noticed is the opposition have planted a bunch of people in the hall for the Secretary Designate of State and of the Defense, Secretary of Defense and the Director of the CIA and so forth, people who don't agree with President Trump and his President-elect Trump and his nominees have planted people in the audience to shout and scream and wave signs before they're ushered out. This is part of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. It's totally ineffectual. It isn't going to change anything, but they have the right, and they can go forth and exercise their right to protest and to petition the government. So this is important. And so, as I said, a republic, if we can keep it. And here in the audience, we have some of the, in the crowd here, we have some of our people, maybe more are coming, but there's Laura and Janice. Raise your hands. There are some citizens who are on the phone with us every week, and they from out in Front Royal, Virginia. And they ask me tough questions, and I try to brief them on what's happening, along with Colonel Myers, who's on periodically too. And so we figure out what can we do to get the Congress to do the right things according to the points of view that we have, that we should be a good friend to our friends, we should oppose those who want to do us harm in the best way that we can. We're not for going to war, but I'm so happy to hear that the nominees who are up today say we should exhaust every means before we are in combat or before we are in a war. And as a veteran myself, I know that we have never, our government, at least in the last 24 years, or maybe in the last, maybe even longer, has never embodied in our policy and in our laws what we've learned, hopefully, from the conflicts in which we've been involved. And so only, I think, President Bush, George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, the first one in the Gulf War in Desert Storm, had such a talented group that he said, well, let's learn from what we did before, and well, let's just restore the boundaries and the sovereignty of Kuwait and stop Saddam Hussein, and then we're going to leave. And he went forth and he got the approval of the United Nations, and he got the approval of the Congress, and the public was behind him. And and he had an exit strategy, and he used the force that he needed, and he did what he went to do, but he didn't march on to Baghdad. Exactly. No, he was on the way. In fact, General Schwarzkopf, I was in Nairobi watching what was happening, and there was General Schwarzkopf saying, well, now we're on our way to Baghdad. 3 hours later, he said, this is over, we're done, we're going home. So, in other words, then the rules were followed. So I'm not saying that is all that we should do. In fact, many would say we ought not get involved so much in other nations' affairs. Some say we should do more to affirm international norms of human rights, protect persecuted minorities, be they Christian, Yazidi, Jews, minority Muslims, and many others, and there is something to that. But now we are coming upon a time when this administration has to look at what has happened. And no administration is perfect, no president or secretary of state are perfect, but each have certain strengths. So Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton was for more participation of women and for more multilateral actions, and she was going to have a reset with Vladimir Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov, except the reset button didn't quite reset. But she had good intentions. And we sometimes have said that, you know what's paved with good intentions, and that's not picking on Secretary Clinton, but, you know, the road to perdition is paved with good intentions. She did her very best, and she tried, but what happened? She got involved, for example, in Libya for a good purpose. She was going to preserve the people of Benghazi from slaughter by Muammar Gaddafi. Now, Secretary Gates at the time said, Gaddafi and Libya are no threat to us. What are we doing? But nobody listened, so they went to help the people of Benghazi be preserved from genocide. And so they said we were going to lead from behind, or whatever that infelicitous phrase was, but we didn't. We were fully involved, and we told the Russian and Chinese delegates at the UN, this is just about human rights, but the next thing we knew, Gaddafi was being toppled. Was Gaddafi a nice man who you would like to have dinner with and you know, allowed to take your daughter out or something? Probably not. But was he a danger to American national security? Not any longer. And also, he had given up his inclinations to develop nuclear and other unconventional arms, I believe, and yet he was toppled, and now we have chaos in Libya. And is that all America's fault or Europe's fault? At least we didn't do what we could to try to have some semblance of stability in Libya and try to let Libya progress to a better state for its people. But what was predicted has indeed happened. There's tribalism, factionalism, chaos, and a base for radical Islamist terror there. But so we need to look at that kind of a precedent. And regardless of how we got involved in war in 2003, the second Gulf War, under President George W. Bush, and whether it was faulty intelligence, and so in we went, and then suddenly we didn't know what to do after that. Baghdad was captured quickly, and then there was no real plan to help Iraq establish and maintain some kind of a responsible government, democracy, etc. So to this day, it's chaotic. So coming up a little farther in, closer came spring of 2011, and there was the Arab Spring. And we saw the crowds in Tahrir Square on TV, and we're looking at it and saying, wow, this is something. Will it be real democracy? Will there be representative government in Iraq? I mean, in Egypt, I meant to say. And so we're looking at Egypt, where a place we often visited and enjoyed to meet the people and to see the antiquities and more. And yet, pretty soon it was clear that Egypt being a relatively quiet, peaceful, friendly place that we could visit might not return for a while. And without going into that whole history, in short, we allowed President Mubarak to be toppled, or maybe encouraged that. Was he a benevolent democratic ruler? Maybe, probably not. But we didn't know what would come next. And so instead of him, we've turned the cycle through a representative elected government to another military figure who is not so different in form from General or President Mubarak. And now we have General al-Sisi. And very interestingly, after all of this, we saw that Egypt was not a threat to us under President Mubarak. And perhaps there would have been a way to progress or to segue toward more democracy, more freedom, a better standard of living for the Egyptians, many of whom live in a very poor state without adequate health care or other amenities. And yet there were forces at work which would not let American foreign aid go to help the people as much as it did to help the military structure of the state. That's another whole story. So we used to try to say, give more money to Mubarak for the purposes of helping his people progress, for education and health and job training and so forth. And yet we could not get traction for that. Everybody wanted to maintain the status quo, although interestingly, President Mubarak reportedly would have been happy to have more of that funding go to help his people, but whatever the forces were that were in play, they wanted to keep it the way it was. Jumping around a little, we look at Ukraine, where Russian forces came into Crimea and then eastern Ukraine. This is not my area of specialization, but America said we want to defend the territorial integrity of the Ukraine, except that reportedly we would not provide very robust military resources for the Ukraine government. Was that the right answer or not? History will tell. But Ukraine had given up its nuclear weapons. So here was another model like Libya, where the government, they're not the same, and there are more differences than similarities, but in each case, the government had given up its nuclear weapons, or in the case of Muammar Gaddafi, an ambition to have nuclear arms, and yet afterwards, Gaddafi was slain in the streets brutally, and the Ukraine government was not assured in its territorial integrity as the major powers had assured they would be. So I'm just saying that there has, I believe, been a bit of a fault in diplomatic practice, and it's not unique to the last administration. It's gone on for some time. And diplomacy is never perfect, and governance is never perfect. But I believe we have an opportunity today, as I say, with this disruptor in chief. I hope he wouldn't be insulted if he were in the room. I mean it with no unkindness, but he does want to change things, doesn't he? And he has brought in all of these generals and corporate executives with a lot of experience and a lot of talent. And I've been sort of looking out of one eye at the hearings when I wasn't answering phone calls from Shoshana as to what I was doing today. So, but it's excellent. I think these nominees are going to do very well. I think they're going to surprise a lot of people. And I think our new president is also going to surprise people by listening to his cabinet. And I think just as President Obama was told that he couldn't just use his BlackBerry that he had brought from civilian life any way he wanted to, but he now had to have new secure communication, so too may our new president be told he can't just tweet anything whenever he likes, but they'll advise him, Mr. President, you just can't do that anymore. Take our advice, and you have to have other means of communication, and you have to be more careful about how you communicate for a lot of reasons that relate to security, even his own personal security. So I expect that a lot of people will be very surprised at and there are a lot of people in this building, half or more, and in all these buildings on the Hill, here on the House side and on the Senate side, who will be very surprised, and in some cases pleasantly surprised, by these changes. There is a great opportunity and it's always a big if President Trump and his cabinet will reach out to the Congress, not just the Republicans, but to the Democrats as well, and say we must do the best we can in the public interest because that's what we're elected to do. And there once was a Baptist preacher. This may be culturally not something that you'll appreciate greatly, except our friends from Front Royal. There was a Baptist preacher who was asked, "Do you believe in baptism by sprinkling?" And he said, "Oh, believe in it? I've seen it done." Anyway, because Baptists dunk people, anyway, when they're of age, not sprinkling them when they're babies. But so I've seen bipartisan government in the public interest done. I helped write the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and many other of our environmental laws, and I helped form our U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And then Israel had heard of what I was doing, and even though I really didn't have any connection with that land, they said, "Come help us." So I helped write their laws and regulations and form their Ministry of Environmental Protection. And in the course of that, even went to Jordan and Egypt and Cyprus and other nations to help formulate a meld, a consensus of the best of what we had done in America to clean up the water and air and protect the land and the creatures on the land, but to do that in these other countries in whatever setting I was. And today, and this is where I'll conclude and open it up to questions, today my dream is that when I look at my iPhone in the morning and I see that the weather in some cities like Mumbai, Delhi, Ulaanbaatar, Shanghai, and Beijing, so that we'll get to a situation where the short take on the weather no longer says smoke. When I look and see that the weather in Mumbai today is smoke, and the same in Delhi and perhaps in some of these other cities, and I've been to Mumbai, I haven't been to the others, or in Beijing it says a great danger to public health. Well, this ought not be, and this is where I hope that we can go to some of these cities and some of these countries, and this is my plan, and we can not go and say, this is what you should do, we have all of this knowledge and information from what we've done. No, we have to go and establish a dialogue, because I'm sure if I go, for example, to any of your countries, I'll find you have excellent professionals who are trying to do their best to clean up the air, clean up the water, make life healthier for the public. And so same too in, as I say, in India, in China, in Mongolia, and so forth. I think there's a great opportunity for interchange of ideas, and when I've gone to these other countries, I've found that I've learned at least as much as I've been able to contribute from my background. So I think we have an open door, and I don't think this administration is going to, or this Congress is going to be antagonistic to those kinds of exchanges, because it helps all around. It helps those countries, it helps the people, that's good, and it helps America, because as these other nations raise their standards for environment, for worker health and safety, and all of these things, obviously there's a cost for that. So there is a leveling of the playing field, even economically. So I've long argued with our union chiefs in America that among the things they should do is insist that when we have agreements with other countries, we should look carefully at how they treat their workers, how they protect the environment, and so forth, because we have great built-in costs because of the way we do things and because of the fact that these so-called externalities, clean air, clean water, and so forth, are built into the process, and there's a regulatory burden and there's a cost. So that's my dream, and also to have more opportunity just for exchange and interaction with all of you from other countries. So with that, I thank you for being here. God bless you. I hope your trip goes well, and I'm open to any questions you may have.
If I may, just maybe we could have the short presentation by Professor
Oh, please,
Greer,
yes.
And then we'll see how much time we have before they
Sure,
come
that's fine, yes.
to move us to the plenary.
Okay, I'd like to maybe,
Pardon me?
Do you have business cards to give everybody?
I think everyone's got them. I have a few
Yours.
left.
Okay.
Yes, thanks.
so I'd like to maybe take off from what you're saying
Please,
about
yes.
the environment. As many of you know from yesterday, I'm an environmental anthropologist,
Oh,
working in
Interesting.
indigenous land rights.
Wow.
And most specifically, the reason why I've begun working in indigenous land rights is that looking across cultures, we find those that are indigenous have more of a tendency to know about the environment, to take care of the environment. We can sometimes even look to our medicines to understand that even today, around 70% of all of our medicines come from the Amazon. Reasons being, you can go into ecology to look into that, but we have a tendency to say that we only know 2% of that, what gives us over 70% of our medicines. And we have to sit and think, well, who is we? Who is we that only knows 2% of the Amazon? Is it the people in the Amazon that only know 2% of their homelands? We tend to say no, it's mostly the outsiders, that the indigenous people actually have much of a greater knowledge about their place and about the potential for things like medicine. So due to that, many of us are focusing on the rights of indigenous people to stay on their lands. Now, working with indigenous people around the world, we necessarily work with big, large, multinational and binational institutions such as the United Nations. And yesterday, a lot of us had the wonderful opportunity to be there in the United Nations.
yes.
While at the same time feeling a bit concerned, especially being somebody from the United States like myself, what is to happen with the United Nations as far as the United States response. And most recently, we've had some resolutions that have caused various politicians to say some pretty serious things. So I'd like to just briefly review, if anybody wants to take a look up there. The first that started to kick off the year for our discussions with the United Nations on behalf of the United States was, shall we defund it? And for any of us that have worked with the United Nations, that's kind of a frightening discussion. Other discussions have been, well, maybe we just potentially suspend our funding for the United Nations until we move an embassy to Jerusalem. Others have gone even farther to say, well, we'll suspend our funding to the United Nations until we move our embassy to East Jerusalem. Quite even more problematic in the discussion of Israel and Palestine. So we have to take a look at what this might cause and the suggestions in Congress and the House as to this is maybe a viable option considering a large sway of influence in that direction. So we've had a discussion about wanting to avoid violence, and we've had a discussion about wanting to take a strong stance, and a lot of the issue has been centered around settlements. Are they legal? Are they not legal? But one of the largest concerns that we might have is looking at how the United States has interacted with the United Nations. And in this last resolution, we have quite a bit of concern about peace and if this is actually going to be accomplished. So if we want to focus briefly on a potentially explosive topic, UN Resolution 2334. It's been suggested that that resolution is potentially provoking a showdown between Washington, D.C. and the UN, where the UN is perhaps dependent on the 20% of funding that the U.S. tends to provide. Is that something that we want to do, make a showdown between the United States government and the UN. Also, we have a discussion that the Jordanian invasion occupation of 1949, while cleansing Jews from the area, also left the opinion that Israel is not to repopulate the area that was taken in the 1967 war. A concern is that this is inconsistent with how the United Nations is working with any other country. So is it possible that in making this resolution we've made even peace more untenable, or untenable at best? We have a problem in that we may have sent messages through this resolution that Palestinians have no need to negotiate directly country to country with Israel. So it appears that maybe the United States has taken themselves and put themselves right in the middle of things, perhaps not as appropriately as they ought. We also have a view that perhaps there is no penalty to the Palestinians for refusing negotiations with Israel after having passed this resolution. We understand that it is quite a lack of consistency with U.S. policy, and that we have a tendency as a government to support country-to-country negotiations. So this is quite a derivation from that support. And while you may not support this resolution, or while you may support this resolution, ultimately the concern here is, are we cutting the legs off of the strength of the United Nations in the manner in which this was presented? So considering the lack of consistency and also considering previous Israeli concessions and negotiations, will we walk away with the fact that maybe they mean nothing, previous negotiations? That in fact, we now come to a point where we're asking the question, hey, what's the point of negotiating with Palestine or the UN from behalf of Israel? Right? So now there's a concern with two very significant parties of the UN, and the largest issue being that we cannot use the United Nations to circumvent the U.S. government. With that, I'd like to thank you for...
Okay, if I
Thank
may,
you. That's-
before you go on to questions.
Thank you. That's
just-
very,
one
that
second.
today it's most critical, because today 2 senators are introducing legislation, as you may know, to basically to defund the UN. I mean, that is to stop the U.S. contribution. So it's,
That's devastating for everybody in the room.
I know, I didn't get to that issue, but it's a real train wreck. I mean, and it needs to be defused, and I haven't seen that happening yet, and we could talk about these other issues if time permitted, yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to go and arrange for the passes, but just to answer all of your questions about let's say, the cooperation between our organization, which is the Interparliamentary Coalition for Global Ethics, and the ICD. We work together on various projects. The Interparliamentary Coalition for Global Ethics basically tries to promote education for what is the UN considers to be the culture of peace. It was introduced to the UN by former Director General Federico Mayor, who is the patron for the Interparliamentary Coalition for Global Ethics. There is a huge amount of written material and resolutions, and I'll give you this brochure, which is a little bit out of date. We have additional board members in the meantime. Just to make very, very briefly, we are now working with members of Parliament for promotion of mandatory legislation for education for the culture of peace from kindergarten on. We hope that will be sort of the tool to equip the youth and adults to be immune to indoctrination for what the UN calls violent extremism. Preventative education, we also achieved to have what they call preventative education in the Secretary General's plan of action to combat violent extremism. What we have agreed upon with the ICD is that all of you who are keen on following up with this symposium could provide us tomorrow. Well, one other aspect here, at the IPCGE, we formed the multi-track council for the culture of peace and SDGs, which calls on civil society, which are religious leaders, educators, and civil, let's say, activists, to help promote this legislation and implement it in the end. Once we are done with the culture of peace, we'll go on to environmental and social issues. But if you have any, we are sort of opening up the council to liaison members, and any of you who have projects that you discussed that you want to continue, if you want to prepare a sort of a one-paragraph proposal to give us tomorrow, and then we could follow up with you and hopefully work for the culture of peace together. So I'm just going to go out and prepare for the passage.
Just something clarified about our speaker today, with your experience about Middle East, and it is good for us. Other thing you said, the Islamic terrorist. This name of Islam, no one terrorist is terrorist.
You're right.
Don't have no.
You're right. Good point.
No any.
I just said, by way of a catchphrase.
Terrorist is terrorist.
Yeah, I said
Islam,
radical.
Religious of peace, religious of love,
Ra-
religious of
yeah.
humanity. This Islam is not terrorist. This
I
is
understand.
Thank you very much.
I understand. Thank you for the clarification, and that's why I tried to be
Thank you very
careful
much.
and to say radical Islamist, jihadist, whatever you wanted to say, where religion is mixed in with
Yeah.
politics. And here in America, you know, our Constitution says that there'll be no established religion, and nor will there be any prohibition against the free exercise of religion. So that's for America. And yet, many nations have a combination of religion and the government, where there is a state religion. People say, for example, that Israel is a Jewish state. Well, if you're an Orthodox Jew, Israel is no way a Jewish state, because they don't have any prescription that you must be Jewish or you must observe a faith in a certain way. So whatever you are, it's really a modern secular state. But I'm not saying what other nations should do, but I'm saying where there's a combination of the radical or extremist element, which I agree with you is not in the mainstream, where that is propelling people to heinous acts in the name of Islam. I think that's what we're trying to oppose. But it's by no means the only source of violence in the world. You're right, sir.
We are very much concerned about the humanitarian crisis at the moment, which is the worst sort of crisis we've seen for a long time. There are 65 million refugees or displaced people.
Yes.
250 million children are trapped in conflict.
Yes.
And you look at the setup that occurs after the wars, when the aggression has taken place, you find that the damage that's done is totally incompatible with what the USA values are.
Yes.
And I feel that the impression that the world is getting about USA is a wrong impression. USA people are extremely good, very, very nice people. But the world outside is seeing them not as nice.
Yes.
Although when I deal with all sorts of people. The other problem is that people talk about the USA having an agenda, having a Western interest to promote arms. So they say that, okay, if peace was brought about, how would they manage with the economy if a high proportion of the income was coming from the sale of arms? So I wonder if you can do something about that, because at the moment the humanitarian agencies are not coping.
Yeah.
There is no funds.
You're right. You're right, and this good points. This is part of the, shall we say, the implosion of foreign policy and international relations, perhaps even for more than the last 8 years, perhaps for, you name it, 16 years, 24 years, however long you want to say. Diplomacy has not been exercised in a way to prevent these situations that have caused the greatest number of refugees since World War II, and the most horrific suffering by people. I've seen it in the Middle East, so it must, something must be done about this. And I think not that other nations don't have a lot to say and do about it, but I really think, with no pride or hubris, I think America has to exercise the right kind of leadership to deal with this humanitarian crisis, just as they dealt with the AIDS crisis and they dealt with these other medical crises. So absolutely, and I think regardless of some of the rhetoric in the political campaigns, I don't think that the new administration is going to disregard such things. I think they do have a heart, and I think our Secretary of State and others will want to deal appropriate, and he has already said he wants to deal with crises and suffering abroad and catastrophes and so forth in the hearing. So we're looking forward to that. With respect to sale of arms, the sale of arms has proliferated, and yes, it's business in America, it's business in Europe, it's business in Russia and other parts of the world. How you can restrain that, I think it's like arms control, it's like handgun control in the United States. I think the real answer, although it's harder to do, is as we would say, to preach a positive message of love for your neighbor, which is the only expression that shows that you really love God. So I think this is common to religion. I, as a Christian, feel and sense this. How you promote that so that people are not thinking how to kill each other or disenfranchise each other or cause harm or dispossess the other of their lands, including the indigenous peoples. I think this is a message not well dealt with by governments, although, as I say, Teddy Roosevelt said he had a bully pulpit in the White House. I think it's from religious leaders who can spread this message that when we go abroad, it shouldn't be to kill and harm and disenfranchise and dispossess anyone of their rightful land and possessions.
They're going to have to go now if they want to see the vote.
Excellence, just one.
Sir, yes.
One second.